Hello, good afternoon. I'm Fred Roeder from the Consumer Choice Center, and as you probably can hear it, I'm German by birth. I didn't choose to be, but that happened. And I thank you so much for the invitation to this fantastic conference. And I've been asked to give a bit of a perspective on the current state of liberalization in Germany and where Germany is headed with its finally formed government. So after about half a year of Belgian or Spanish flair, Germany actually came to sanity and formed a government. And obviously, Germany is internationally known as the world champion in exporting manufactured goods. The last half decade were also Germany shaped the fiscal debates on not only supporting some weaker economies in the EU, but also by having budget surpluses, or at least no additional deficit. And since the crisis of 2008, 2009, Germany managed to reduce its share of debt on GDP from about 85-ish percent to down to 66%, I think is the current, the latest number, if I'm right. That was mainly done because of economic growth and no additional debt. So it's not really that we paid off our debt. A tiny bit, but most of this is actually just like if you private sector grows faster than the public sector, these things happen. So far, structurally, the development of the last 5 years looked fantastic, and you would say, wow, this last grand coalition of the Conservatives and Social Democrats must have done a fantastic job, and they must be all fantastic classical liberals understanding on how to restructure an economy. But actually, that did not happen. We were very lucky that the global economy is sort of doing fairly well, and Chinese are buying, and still Brits and Americans are buying from Germans and some other parts of the world, and even the Russia crisis did not too much impact German exports. So the labor market is booming. It's hard to find qualified employees. But at the same time, probably the last 4 years, the last German government, which is again the same German government, so we had a grand coalition, and then it took them half a year to figure out that they want to continue this abusive marriage. The old and the new government already set the foundations for an end of this restoration of financial sanity in Germany, or fiscal sanity. So the last legislative period, they introduced minimum wage laws and rent control, two things which are very common in many economies in the world, but Germany actually did not have rent control, no minimum wages. Surprise, surprise, if you look at the rent you pay in Berlin and compare that to Paris, Milan, or London, it's like a third. I mean, I just moved actually from Berlin to London, and I pay, I think, 8 times more per square meter. So maybe that actually parts, at least, of the very low living costs in Germany were also attributed to government staying out of that sector. That will probably soon change. The same Germany actually lived very well, for a very long time without minimum wage laws, but now has them. And once this very dangerous tool of minimum wage laws is introduced, it's just about up to election campaigns and who's going to increase the minimum wage more, since you already have this fantastic tool to redistribute wealth. So when the Social Democrats finally agreed to reinstate their coalition or renew their coalition with the Christian Democrats, the leader of the Social Democrats, Andrea Nahles, already said it's going to cost them a lot. So she was actually referring to the Conservatives. It's going to cost them a lot of concessions, like more public spending, more social welfare programs. But actually, it's not going to cost the Conservatives money, but it's going to cost the taxpayer and future generations money. So the Social Democrats, but actually also the Christian Democrats, are pushing for more public expenditure, and probably there's going to be an arms race in who's going to offer more goodies to their voter groups. So before I very quickly just say where the big structural problems, in my opinion, or the most bizarre ones are in Germany, I quickly would like to acknowledge that there are a couple of sectors Germany liberalized fantastically. If you look at the hospital system, so the inpatient health sector, it works really well. 70% of hospitals are not owned by government anymore, and they're really in competition against each other. We have a voucher system which works better than most other large European countries if you look at health systems. The telecommunications market has been liberalized fairly successfully, mainly thanks to the EU, and that was actually happened when I was still fairly young, but it worked out pretty well, and there is competition for the last 20 years. Very recent example Germany actually kind of spearheaded was the bus market liberalization, where the EU is actually now looking at the German example, where a couple of years ago Germany finally legalized competition in the bus market, trans-city, intercity bus market, which is fantastic. Tens of thousands of new jobs has been generated, and then people who could not afford to travel between cities before can actually do this now. And also in some infrastructure projects, especially in airports, and some airports are privately owned, privately run, and work really well. Those where the government tries it, for instance, the failed attempt of building a new airport in Berlin, failed miserably and cost billions. Probably one thing where Germany is really the least liberal and the most statist or sclerotic player in the EU is the pharmacy market. So Germany has about 20,000 pharmacies. It's quite a lot per capita, one of the highest amount of pharmacies in Europe. And basically the pharmacy regulation stems from the medieval ages. You still have a pharmacy guild, which is in charge of admitting new pharmacists or denying new pharmacists to join the guild. And if you're not in the guild, you cannot operate. Pharmacies are only allowed to be owned by pharmacists. So a joint stock company, or if you're not a pharmacist, you're not allowed to be a shareholder of a pharmacy. Something like Boots Alliance, these large chains of pharmacies do not exist in Germany, and they're illegal because only pharmacists are allowed to own them, and a pharmacist is maximum allowed to own 4 pharmacies. So if you're really, really smart entrepreneur as a pharmacist and you want to scale up, you make sure to marry a pharmacist as well, because then you can have 8. And you have children really early on and send them to pharmacy school, and you have a couple of them, because per child you can have like 4 additional pharmacies in your family. But this is, and it's even more bizarre if your parents are pharmacists and they have 8 pharmacies, and they get hit by a bus, both of them, and unfortunately die, and you're the sole child and you're not a pharmacist. You would think you would inherit these 8 pharmacies, which is like a couple of million in assets. But you only have 1 year to sell all the 8 pharmacies, because you're not allowed as a heir, which is not a pharmacist, to own these pharmacies longer than 8 years. 1 year. So basically you have 1 year to sell it. And of course everyone who wants to buy it knows that the clock is ticking and you have to sell. So it's a really bizarre system, which also actually is almost like an infringement of property rights and the right to actually give the assets you own to your family members. A couple of other things is that basically every drug being sold on a prescription in a pharmacy, at least 8 euros go to the pharmacist in revenue. So even if you buy an aspirin on prescription, or like some generic aspirin, but your doctor prescribes it, and the price of this aspirin or this generic aspirin might be 20 cents, the pharmacist still gets 8 euros from the public health system. So there's also an incentive of selling always the smallest pack, because it doesn't matter if you sell 10 or 30 packs, pills per pack, you always get your 8 euros. So you rather want, yes, okay. So this is really bizarre, especially ownership restrictions. Another huge issue in Germany are shopping hours, business hours. Sundays, you still cannot shop. I think only Austria has like worse opening times. The taxi market is a huge issue. A federal court banned Uber X, Uber Pop. So now the Uber we have in Germany is basically chauffeur services, which are can only be marginally cheaper than taxi rides. And probably just as the outlook, occupational licensing. About 13 years ago, we had a massive reform of occupational licensing, where lots of licenses got struck down, which was actually also a deal between the Conservatives and Social Democrats. Now, actually, the new government says we actually want to tighten occupational licensing again, because they say there are too many people working in crafts professions, like carpenters and the guy who makes the roofers and all these different professions. I mean, currently we have a real estate construction boom in Germany, and it takes you 3, 4, 5 months to actually get the right handyman to come to your building and finish it. So there's absolutely no oversurplus or overflow of these professions, but someone apparently lobbied the government to try to actually tighten these regulations again, make it harder for people to join these professions to actually are needed. So the outlook for this new government is probably, unfortunately, they started with a good position, or fortunately they started with a good position, but most likely we're not going to see any liberalization in the next 4 years, but rather the opposite. Economic policies in Germany are currently not guided by any economic common sense, but just by rent seeking. And unfortunately, this is something we're going to see, and hopefully there's going to be some pressure by EU institutions to keep some benefits of the internal market and not re-regulate parts of the German economy.